The Taliban have a reason to believe that we would make good on that threat, that it was a valid threat? And likewise, what steps, when you formulate a policy to make that kind of a threat, what steps did you take to ensure that we, in fact, had a credible military force that could enforce that?
Well, first of all, as I said, President Clinton had ordered that lethal force be used. There were armed submarines in the Arabian Sea and a variety bombers on standby and ready to go, so that the orders were there. The President also asked for a variety of options from the Pentagon. In terms of special forces, a variety of, as far as I know, there was no option off the table, and that there were questions about the Pentagon saying that these were not viable. You will have Secretary Cohen here, and you can ask him these questions, but I do know that from the perspective of one of the members of the Principals Committee, I as Secretary of State, can assure you that the President asked for a variety of military options. And so I again think that you have to, from my perspective, the Pentagon did not come forward with viable options in response to what the President was asking for.
As the urgent domestic issues accumulated, White House Deputy Chief of Staff Joshua Bolten chaired the temporary domestic consequences group. The agenda in those first few days is worth noting, partly as a checklist for future crisis planners. It began with the problems of how to help victims and staunch the flowing losses to the American economy, such as organizing federal emergency assistance. One question was what kind of public health advice to give about the air quality in Lower Manhattan in the vicinity of the falling buildings. Compensating victims. They evaluated legislative options, eventually setting up a federal compensation fund and defining the powers of a special master to run it. Determining federal assistance. On September 13th, President Bush promised to provide $20 billion for New York City, in addition to the $20 billion his budget director had already guessed might be needed for the country as a whole. Restoring civil aviation. On the morning of September 13th, the national airspace reopened for use by airports that met newly improvised security standards. Reopening the financial markets. After extraordinary emergency efforts involving the White House, the Treasury Department, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, aided by unprecedented cooperation among the usually competitive firms of the financial industry, the markets reopened on Monday, September 17th. Deciding when and how to return border and port security to more normal operations, and evaluating legislative proposals to bail out the airline industry and cap its liability. The very process of reviewing these issues underscored the absence of an effective government organization dedicated to assessing vulnerabilities and handling problems of protection and preparedness. Through a number of agencies, there have been some part of the task. None had security as its primary mission. By September 14th, Vice President Cheney had decided to recommend, at least as a first step, a new White House entity to coordinate all the relevant agencies rather than tackle the challenge of combining them in a new department. This new White House entity would be a Homeland Security Advisor and Homeland Security Council, paralleling the National Security Council system. Vice President Cheney reviewed the proposal with President Bush and other advisors. President Bush announced the new post and its first occupant, Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge, in his address to a joint session of Congress on September 20th. Beginning on September 11th, Immigration and Naturalization Service agents working in cooperation with the FBI began arresting individuals for immigration violations whom they encountered while following up leads in the FBI's investigation of the 9/11 attacks. Eventually, 768 aliens were arrested as special interest detainees. Some, such as Zacarias Moussaoui, were actually in INS custody before 9/11. Most were arrested after Attorney General John Ashcroft told us that he saw his job in directing this effort as risk minimization, both to find out who had committed the attacks and to prevent a subsequent attack. Ashcroft ordered all special interest immigration hearings closed to the public, family members, and press, directed government attorneys to seek denial of bond until such time as they were cleared of terrorist connections by the FBI and other agencies, and ordered the identity of the detainees kept secret. INS attorneys charged with prosecuting the immigration violations had trouble getting information about the detainees and other terrorist connections. In the chaos after the attacks, it was very difficult to reach law enforcement officials who were following up on other leads. Clearance process approved by the Justice Department was time-consuming, lasting an average about 80 days. We at the Commission have assessed this effort to detain aliens of special interest. The detainees were lawfully held on immigration charges. Records indicate that 531 were deported, 162 were released on bond, 24 received some kind of immigration benefits, 12 had their proceedings terminated, and 8 of them, one of whom was Zacharias Moussaoui, were remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals Service. The Inspector General of the Justice Department found significant problems in the way the 9/11 detainees were treated. In response to a request about the counterterrorism benefits of the 9/11 detainee program, the Justice Department cited 6 individuals on the special interest detainee list, noting that 2, including Moussaoui, were linked directly to a terrorist organization and that it had obtained new leads helpful to the investigation of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. A senior al-Qaeda detainee had stated that U.S. government efforts after the 9/11 attacks to monitor the American homeland, including review of Muslims' immigration files and deportation of non-permanent residents, forced al-Qaeda to operate less freely in the United States. The government's ability to collect intelligence inside the United States and the sharing of such information between the intelligence and law enforcement communities was not a priority before 9/11. Guidelines on this subject issued in August of 2001 by Deputy Attorney General Larry Thompson essentially recapitulated prior guidance. However, the attacks of 9/11 changed everything. Less than 1 week after September 11th, an early version of what was about to become the Patriot Act, officially the USA Patriot Act, began to take shape. A central provision of the proposal was the removal of the wall on information sharing between the intelligence and law enforcement communities. Ashcroft told House at the Commission he was determined to take every conceivable action within the limits of the Constitution to identify potential terrorists and deter additional attacks. The administration developed a proposal that eventually passed both houses of Congress by large majorities and was signed into law on October 26th.